So welcome everybody. Tonight is the second session of the Human Ape and Evolutionary History of Human Cognitive Capacities. We're happy to have Shahin here. Actually, he's one of our old members, so I shouldn't introduce him. He will introduce himself. But he's professor at University of McGill. He got his PhD in neuroscience, and we're happy to have you here. This is actually something that he teach actually in McGill University, the cognitive capacity and the cognitive science. But he will tell us more about himself and about the subject. Thank you, Shahin.
Thank you, everybody. I don't know what I should add on top of what I've already told you in terms of who I am, where I come from. In a nutshell, as Pasha said, well, maybe a little beyond that, back in time, I got my bachelor's degree at the University of British Columbia, UBC. I moved to Montreal to work on my doctorate at McGill, which took me a while, and then moved on to do a postdoc at the Montreal Neurological Institute, working on cognitive neuroscience issues, particularly how faces and voices come together to form representations of individual identities, and then moved back to McGill Psychology since 2009, and I've been doing some work in the area of, well, as you can gather from this title, in the area of evolution of cognitive capacities. So we've been working with old world monkeys, new world monkeys, and humans to some extent. And what I'm about to delve into tonight is an extension of what we started talking about last time, by way of giving you a roadmap as to what we'll be discovering together. I'll start with a quick recap of last session's presentation, just to bring everybody up to speed with what has been said, and or perhaps to refresh your memories about what we discussed. Then, as was very kindly suggested by one of the audience members, I should get into some detail about what we're talking about, what are cognitive capacities. So I'll go over a very, very quick treatment of this topic, just literally going through sort of a shopping list of what sorts of things preoccupy the minds of a cognitive scientist, what sorts of things they're interested in finding answers to, and I'll focus on a particular domain of this vast area, namely problem solving, which is what we ended the last session with. I'll get into more detail about what problem solving is, what sorts of methods and styles there are for solving problems, and we go back to the videos a little bit more and try to look at them with this, maybe with this lens, and try to see how well or how poorly these lower primates end up faring these sorts of challenges in terms of problem solving. And an extension of problem solving, which we'll discover a bit more tonight, has to do with the use of objects or shaping of objects to achieve certain goals, which we call tool making or using of tools and so on. And we'll see how that in that particular domain very important discoveries are being made about the capacities that these apes have in terms of using objects to achieve certain goals. And we start seeing perhaps the beginnings of art history in terms of using basically sticks and stones and things of that nature, and find some common grounds between us and these lower primates. Then very quickly we'll go over how learning is achieved. Learning being one of the most important aspects of cognition. It's the way by which we acquire information and then recall that information through our memory capacities in order to, again, achieve certain tasks after the initial information has gone away. And in that light, we try to make a distinction between what imitation is compared to emulation, and what sort of, whether we can draw a distinction between us and apes in terms of the strategies we use for learning new tasks and achieving certain goals. So without further delay, let me just go back to a couple of slides I showed you previously. So the story began by saying that if we consider some elaborate part of our body, like our arm or our hand, having gone through some changes throughout the history of life to take its particular form and shape as compared to other sorts of arms or limbs that we see in nature, we could extend that conclusion to our brains, given that our brain, or the brain, is part of an organism's body, and we see various forms and shapes of it in nature. We can establish an evolutionary history for the development or emergence of a human brain as it stands at this point in time. Going back several tens of millions of years, we start with these very basic primate brains that occupy very small volumes in the skull of these creatures, and then as we go through as we sort of move forward in time, we see that the brain is taking on a larger, disproportionately larger volume compared to body size in humans. And with that has come a great deal of cognitive, if you will, cognitive capacities, or an expansion of cognitive capacities. And that all revolves around the notion that basically the mind is assumed to be made up of distinct modules, just like putting, I suppose, different Lego blocks together to make a distinct shape or object. You can think of the mind as being formed of these distinct modules that have been sort of assembled to take on the form and shape that it has for, let's say, an adult human being. So each module has been shown to be very, very specialized to carry out very distinct functions, and these functions could range anywhere from lower levels of cognitive processing, which have to do with perception of color and shapes and so on and so forth, to very high level cognitive processes which involve executive function and inhibition and planning, all sorts of things that have to do with what defines us as humans compared to other animals. So, just like the way that our, let's say, our hand has evolved with respect to the selective pressures that have been around for millions or hundreds of millions of years, you can say that each of these modules, or the function of each of these modules, is also the result of adaptive processes that ended up conferring some sort of advantage, both in terms of sexual selection or sexual behavior and survival, upon the organism that had it. And I presented several examples to demonstrate this, which I won't have time to get into right now, but we could, if you have any questions about them, if it's your first time, we could definitely discuss them afterwards. So the mind essentially becomes the conglomerate of these individual modules, each of which have gone through this adaptive process throughout the history of that organism. And there are, as I said last time, there are several theories that deal with the mechanics of how these evolutionary processes have culminated in the sort of the emergence of the human mind. again, a very lengthy discussion which we won't have time for. But essentially, they all revolve around, if they're supposed to last from one generation to the next, they revolve around processes that end up imprinting those adaptations into the DNA of the organism, so that the next generation would benefit from having those kinds of changes that have come about. And over the course of many generations, you end up seeing segregations of organisms, not just in terms of their anatomy, but also in terms of their cognitive capacities. Anyhow, so what are cognitive capacities, and what is cognitive psychology all about? So what is it that is supposed to be undergoing these changes? And I'm going to take up a few minutes of your time to just give you an overview of what cognitive psychology is, and then we'll go through the list of a short list of various faculties that seem to be of importance, particularly to this documentary as it's proceeding in its time course. So this is a very textbook sort of definition of what cognitive psychology is. So it's basically the study of normal mental function and its relationship with behavior. So because it's the study of mental function, and we have very little handle on sort of putting mental functions in a scale and weigh it, or put it under the microscope and see it, we have to resort to very intelligent tools and methodologies to try to understand these mental functions and tease them apart from each other. So, for example, cognitive psychologists can attempt to explain basically the comprehension of sensory information, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, and that sort of thing, how we end up comprehending and producing language, how we retain information and then retrieve that information in various contexts, basically memory function, how we can direct this very precious resource we call attention to different tasks, or whether we can split attention across different tasks and carry out different kinds of things, and so on and so forth. So the list goes on and on. But it all basically fits in the context of a chain of events that typically starts with something being out there in the environment. So this very basic diagram has a good way of conveying a great deal of what I'm about to get into, and also gives you a good picture, a simple but good picture of how cognition fits in with other, if you will, other mental and sensory physiological processes. So, as I said, typically something has to exist in the environment to trigger at some point mental processes. We call that, in scientific terms, an environmental stimulus or an event. That stimulus, in order for it to have any sort of mental process associated with it, has to somehow be attended to. There are tons of things, stimuli out there in the world that are there, but completely out of our minds because we are not processing them, or we're not paying attention to them. If I draw your attention to the sounds or the noise that's coming from the street, then you can hear something, and you could probably figure out whether it's a car or somebody walking, or I don't know, a cat meowing or something. But if not, your attention is directed to the screen, to what's being presented, or to me, or whatever. Or the only sound that you are processing right now is possibly the sound of my voice. Okay, so that attended stimulus, by virtue of being attended to, ends up interacting with our sensory organs. Sensory organs being as obvious as our eyes, or the sensitive part of our eyes at the back of the eye, our retinae, the receptors in our skin, or the receptors in our ears. At any rate, this interaction has to take place between the energies that are emitted by these environmental stimuli and their appropriate receptors. So for an object to be seen, obviously your eyes have to somehow be directed at it, or it won't be seen by you. For sound to be heard, it has to somehow, that those waves have to travel all the way to the inside of your head to interact with the inner ear and start triggering a response. So when those interactions take place, a very fundamental transformation of energy takes place. In essence, this transformation is called transduction, where in physical terms, when an energy is basically transformed from one form to another, is essentially what happens at every moment that an attended stimulus is being processed. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about what happens to electricity to electricity and the light that you observe coming out of a light bulb or this ceiling lamp. Again, electrical energy somehow gets transformed into light, into electromagnetic radiation, and that becomes the stimulus that you see. Now, the same sort of thing, transformation has to happen for light to be able to register, if you will, with your nervous system and become part of your mental processing. And that transformation, or that transduction process for all senses, have to do with the transformation of the incoming energy, whether it be light or sound or tactile pressures or whatever, to a singular form that we call neural energy, for the lack of a better term. So you have to turn that into some form of biochemical or bioelectrical signaling that then becomes compatible with the operations of the nervous system and then moves forward along the chain of events. Now, when that transduction takes place, which is what happens in the sensory organs, those signals that are produced, those bioelectrical signals, if you will, are processed to some extent, which again becomes a very complicated process and something really outside the scope of what we're talking about. To then result in your conscious awareness of what exists outside in your environment. So these steps are taking place without your conscious awareness, are unfolding in their own time and in their own space, and only at one moment they culminate in you saying, there is light, or there was a sound, or I saw a shape, or something of that sort, or somebody poked me, or something like that. Right? So before that, these are all sorts of things that are going behind the scene, and at that moment where you have conscious awareness is where we say perception has taken place. We make a distinction between perception and cognition by saying that cognition takes place, if you will, one step further once you're able to attach some sort of semantic label or some name, if you will, to that experience. Before you can do that, it's in your conscious awareness, but it hasn't been recognized, or cognition hasn't taken place. Once cognition has taken place is when you have associated that experience with some already known phenomena, or compare it with some already known phenomena to be able to distinguish it from past experiences. Now that becomes the food for that basically that conscious awareness, and the ability to recognize that becomes, if you will, the food for these other mental processes which we're going to go through, which ultimately culminate in some form of appropriate action towards whatever caused the initial sort of sequence of events. If it was, let's say, I don't know, if you're a butterfly collector, you see a butterfly on a tree, then the action you might take is to go forward and explore it further, and so on and so forth. So the fact that you're going forward relies upon all of these things that have taken place so far. Most of which we're not at all aware of. These are always going on behind the scenes to allow us to generate appropriate actions or behaviors towards the stimulus. And once we end up acting upon the world, then we become engaged in this, we become an active participant, if you will, in this process of perceiving and recognizing the world as we move through it and interact with it. So that's essentially where sort of cognition fits in with all these other processes that are going on. And I would say a word or two about these arrows, but maybe a bit later on as we talk about various methodologies.
On the previous slide, you were talking about the definition of the cognitive study of cognitive psychology.
Yes.
And a part of that is study of normal mental function. This normalization is mostly in the perception part, and it's
what I refer to as normal mental function is a way of distinguishing it from abnormal mental function, which is what happens in clinical cases where people have problems with attention, with memory, with this and that. So what the average person does with this stimulus, or how their mind operates. Okay, so a couple of words about methods used in cognitive psychology, because they become, at least knowing them becomes useful in understanding how these other things we're talking about, or we will see, are being measured and reported to the audience. So emphasis is obviously on experimental control and accurate measurement of response. This field has gone through massive revolution since the late 19th century. Measurements of cognitive function started really with just measuring reaction time to specific sets of things. For example, Wundt was one of the first, was the founder of possibly the earliest cognitive psychology lab, if you can call it that, back in those days, where he managed to put people in front of these very simple devices where they would see a stimulus and they would have to respond. As simple as that. Just like what you do when the traffic light turns green. You're waiting, you see it's green, and then you step on the gas and move forward. A very simple stimulus response type of association. And then he would build on the complexity of what people have to do to gain insight into what kinds of additional mental processes might be going on and how much longer those additional mental processes are taking on top of the initial stimulus response type of thing, which is again a way of saying that we've come a long way from then. Although the essence of the scientific approach is still the same. You try to have very specific things that you want to measure, and you do those measurements in the context of controls. But our methodologies have evolved over time to include very sophisticated things that I'll talk about in a second. But essentially, the problem still persists that we do not have direct access to those mental processes, and it's only through inferences that we make with these very, very careful observations that we can say something meaningful about what's going on in somebody's mind. Again, we can't take the mind like a piece of brain tissue and put it under the microscope and say, okay, it's changed this way or that way in response to these task demands and so on. But we can, as I said, we can carefully design experiments that tell us what may be going on behind the scenes, and basically draw inferences about the nature of these underlying processes. So the next slide, in a schematic way, shows you some of, well, possibly the three categories, the only sort of ways that we can make these sorts of measurements in various contexts. Either we are making inferences about the relationship between what is being presented or what is being seen or heard or whatever, and mental state that is generated or elicited as a result of that, which is something that we do very readily with humans and more with animals as our testing paradigms are becoming more sophisticated. But essentially, we're, for example, showing a pair of stimuli to a human subject who's viewing them, and we're asking them to say whether or not these two stimuli are the same. Now, these two stimuli could be identical physically or non-identical physically, but they could still be perceived to be the same. Those minute changes between the two could not be perceptible, therefore people continue saying they're the same. But at some point the difference becomes large enough that the two end up looking, if you will, different from each other. Or if there are two sounds, they end up sounding different from each other, and so on and so forth. So that's one way to establish what sort of mental processing is involved, for example, in the processing of color, and how colors are perceived, and how they're categorized, and so on and so forth. We could be interested in, or we could be somehow led to study the physiological response of the nervous system to those stimuli, in which case we, until about maybe 15-20 years ago, we were restricted to using animal models for that, because the only way we could gain access to the brain tissue was to drill holes in the skull and to have electrodes that penetrated the brain, and so on and so forth. So you would listen to the population response of a bunch of neurons, or you could isolate a single one and sort of record in real time how it would behave towards certain stimuli. So that would be a different way of describing mental processes, if you will, by focusing only on the physiological aspect of those processes. Remember, physiology was part of that whole circle. It was one of the first few nodes in that diagram. Or, as I said, in the modern time, we are able to do all of those things at the same time by putting somebody in let's say in a brain scanner and taking a picture, if you will, a volumetric picture of their brain, of their active brain, while they're performing certain tasks, and we can make very educated or draw very educated conclusions about what is going on in which part of the brain in response to these stimuli, and how those specific mental functions or mental processes are localized in different brain areas. And that gives us insight into the modularization of the mind and its relationship to the brain. And in essence, we're doing both of those things at the same time, looking at the physiological response and the perceptual outcome of the mental, the sort of the announcement of those mental events through somebody's response pattern, whether it's through speech or pressing a button or something of that sort. So to illustrate these points, I thought I should put you guys through an exercise, turn you guys into subjects, and show you how a simple task versus a more complex task end up taking, a more complex task versus a simple task ends up taking a little bit more mental time to process. And based on what we discover together, we can make some inferences about what may be going on, okay? Which is not far from the reality of it. So in this exercise, your task is to name the color of these objects that you see. Very simple, and you could be brave enough to say it out loud so I hear how well you're doing, or say it to yourself or to your neighbor. Okay, so here we go. Okay, that wasn't too bad, right? That was part one. So do the same to this next set of objects. your job is still to say what color. There.
Yellow.
Green.
Green.
Yellow.
Yeah.
Red.
Red.
Blue.
Okay. So same thing as before, except now you have this urge to speak out the words that you read, and your mind is conflicted as to which it should do first. And that adds to your reaction time, it decreases your accuracy, and that tells us something about what's going on. That your automatic response to linguistic symbols is interfering with the process of color naming, which is something we should be good at. We learned that when, I don't know, my kids learned that when they were like a year and a half, 2 years old. Right? So it's been with us much longer than language, or the ability to read. Yet, because I suppose because we read more often than we name colors, that ability to read interferes with this process. So we can say that there are two competing processes going on. We could, very, very intelligently hypothesize about what may be going on, and these two processes sort of clash with each other to reduce your reaction time. And this is precisely what Wundt and several of his contemporaries used to do back in the days, where they only had little light bulbs and little response boxes that people had to press on. With that sort of concluding the introduction, I want to now get into a list of these cognitive capacities, and then go back to the, before ending this list, go back to the video where we left it last time, and revisit the problem-solving issue one more time, and then come back to talk about what problem-solving is all about. All right, so, and I must qualify this list by saying that it's not by any means an exhaustive list. You could flip through many texts on cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, and you may find variations on this theme, but these items that I've pulled up are found in almost all of these texts and are agreed upon by most people who do work in this area. So perception is one of the basic levels or basic aspects of cognitive processing, and it sort of lies at the bottom of a hierarchy, if you will, because information has to go through the senses, through those physiological processes. It has to be represented at the perceptual level before, if you will, cognition can act upon it. So some people include it as a most fundamental aspect of cognition, and some people treat it as a separate category altogether. Regardless, it's part of your mental life, or our mental life, and it needs to be treated accordingly. So it has to do basically with how people process in a particular domain visual information, or in a broad sense, information of all kinds, obviously through sensory channels, and how we end up recognizing visual objects. One of the key questions is basically, what is the relative importance of bottom-up processing of visual input and top-down knowledge and expectation about what is being seen? So cognitive psychologists make this distinction between, again, they think of everything as a hierarchy, with the environment being at the bottom of this, and as we get, I guess, further and further into the mind, planning and language and all those things being sort of at the top of this hierarchy. So as the information is coming in, how much contribution does the information content itself have on perceptual processes? How much, let's say, the color of an object, or the shape of an object, or the speed at which it's moving ends up capturing your mental processes to engage in the further processing of that object? And to what extent is top-down influences, such as your knowledge and expectation, what are coming, those things that are coming from, let's say, the upper levels of your mind, what contribution do they have on what is being picked from the environment? So I always use this analogy to draw this the distinction between top-down and bottom-up, and it seems to work for most people. So imagine you're going to the airport to pick up a friend. Right? That friend has a face like everybody else, and the arrangement of his or her facial features allows you to distinguish him or her from everybody else. Otherwise, you would be walking back home with anybody who has a face. So we use the face as a distinguishing feature to separate that individual from everybody else who has a face. So in that sense, we're using some kind of a template for our search in the vast sea of information of all sorts of facial features and facial configurations to find the specific person that we need to take home. So that's considered some form of top-down influence on perception. It's that template in your mind, in your memory, is acting as a filter to sift through the environment and find the one you're looking for. But as you're looking for your friend, you may all of a sudden be distracted by, I don't know, somebody with a green mohawk, right? Just passing by. You weren't looking for that person, but there is something distinctive about the information content, about the visual information content that captures your attention. And you're distracted for maybe a split second, maybe even longer, looking at that, processing that further until you move back onto your task at hand. So this is the way you can distinguish between what is bottom-up, what is top-down, and what ends up winning this battle of capturing your mind or your attention for further processing that information. Another way you can look at this, look at visual perception is by looking at displays like what you see here. I'm going to stop this for a second because the question is asking you, what can you see in this picture? One of the things you might say very accurately is that you see a bunch of black dots against the white background. That's not very far from reality until something happens, right? Until a bunch of these dots start moving together at the same speed towards the same destination, if you will. And that movement, that coordinated movement of these individual parts, all of a sudden gives life to those collection of dots. You can recognize it as a dog, you could even call it a Dalmatian, and you could very easily describe the trajectory and possibly the speed of movement. And of course, seeing something like this begs the question of how it happens, why it happens like that, and what sort of mental processes are involved in making those judgments. And of course, that's not what we want to get into, but it was an example of the kinds of things that people who study perception may be interested in. Another domain of work in cognitive psychology has to do with what you see in these pictures. This is becoming a more and more relevant topic these days. It's not about driving or speaking or using a telephone, but it's about doing both of them at the same time. Right? So we're talking about how we can allocate this mysterious cognitive resource we have called attention to various tasks. People talk about attention as something that resembles a flashlight, if you will, that sort of illuminates a specific part of the world or sheds light on a specific part of the world, enhances the processing of information in that part of the world. Some people make the distinction in terms of whether attention can be a singular resource or something that could be divided across different tasks or modalities and so on and so forth. These are the sort of questions that preoccupy people who study attention in the domain of cognitive science. So In terms of selective attention, the kinds of relevant questions are one relevant question is one that you see here. How do we focus attention on one source of information while ignoring other sources? How do you listen to what's being said instead of what's going on in the street? Or how do you, or to what extent can you divide your attention between tasks or across tasks? Is it possible to do more than one thing at a time? And if so, how efficient are we? How productive are we? Which brings us back to those pictures that we saw earlier. Can we actually do those things? Use our cell phones, I don't know, text somebody, drive at the same time? And the answer seems to be possibly no. And if we can, we're not going to be good at either one of them as good as if we just pay attention to one of those things at a time. Anyhow, that's not. I'm not here to teach anybody a lesson. Just illustrating the point about what people study in the attention domain. Then, of course, we have to deal with the way our minds deal with the retention and recall of information. I've already, I think, once talked about this extensively, how memory is defined and treated by the brain. So one of the earliest questions posed in this domain had to do with the structure of memory. Can we actually define a structure or framework to this vast domain we call memory? And the answer invariably is yes. We can make a distinction at least between a short-lived memory or a reservoir for information and a much longer-term storage that we often call long-term memory. Each one has its own utility, and they interact with one another, and they're both needed for but again, it's not something we're going to get into. A way to test your memory to see at least how well your short-term memory works is to read the following list of numbers. They're going to disappear in about 3 seconds, and then you can try to remember as many of them as possible. And it's not just a waste of time, it tells us something about how information ends up being stored and what is more accessible for recall later on than others. So look at this list and try to jot it down in that specific sequence. And invariably people find that remembering the first few and the last few are easier than the middle parts, and they have to do with the length of processing, the length of encoding, and so on and so forth. Each one has its own. Each phenomenon has a specific term attributed to it, and so on and so forth. Again, we could be talking about this for another hour or two, but we won't do that. Next topic is how knowledge and concepts are treated by our minds. So knowledge is a collection of all the pieces of, if you will, useful information that we've gathered throughout our lives. And those pieces of information give rise to mental representations, which we call concepts. And these concepts seem to be, or our knowledge, our body of knowledge, seem to be structured in a very, if you will, very organized way in the mind, in the form of categories. So categories define the way in which information gets parceled in, if you will, in different pigeonholes in the brain or in the mind. And one of the main questions that people ask or have been asking in this domain is how, what are the rules that govern group membership? Which piece of information or what concept goes with what concept? What determines the if you will, group membership of these concepts? And there are various theories that deal with it: the prototype approach, the exemplar approach, which have to do with either taking some form of statistical average to have a prototype of all the information that is in a particular category, and if this new piece of information resembles that average, then it becomes part of that category. If it doesn't resemble that average, it must resemble some other average, and it goes into a different category. Or versus the exemplar approach, which is the most memorable, the most distinctive member of the category representing that category. Not a statistical average, but think of birds and what comes to your mind. What is the picture of a bird in your mind? Whatever resembles that becomes associated with the concept of birds, and so on and so forth. So, again, the questions go on and on, but this is an illustration of what kinds of things are involved in the treatment of this particular cognitive capacity. So, for example, what are the impacts, if any, of prior knowledge or culture on categorization? Do people coming from different cultures categorize the same amount, same piece of information differently? And one of the very good examples of the impact of knowledge on categorization comes from the work that has been done on people who are first generation or second generation immigrants. They have an ancestry which is not very distant from, let's say, Asia, from China, Iran, some other place, but they're living in North America or in Europe, which has a very distinct, very different cultural fabric. And these people, for example, when they're asked to categorize, to group 3 items that include, what was it again? A cow, chicken, and grass, right? If you were to make two groups out of these 3 items, how would you do that? It turns out it depends on which language you ask that question. If you ask it in let's say, Cantonese or Mandarin, people draw the line between cow and grass because they're related in a more meaningful way together. Their culture revolves around relations or establishing relations between concepts. Whereas if you ask it in English, people draw the line around cow and chicken because they're taxonomically related to it. They're both animals versus a vegetable, right? Or versus a plant or something. So then language and culture end up sort of playing, having very distinct influences on how knowledge is stored and related to one another. And lastly, of course, this is one of the newer lines of research in this area, how are categories related conceptually? So people come up with computer models and neural net models to try to mimic how the mind is operating, and of course how those categories are related to the actual structure of the brain and its makeup. At any rate, one thing that definitely appears to distinguish us from lower primates is our ability to produce language, to comprehend language, and to be creative at the use of language. So when we're talking about humans, then language deals with various issues, and again the list could go on and on. But one of the main areas of research has to do with the comprehension of language. What sequence of mental events enable you to understand spoken language? How do we, for example, parse a stream of vocal signature in order to structure it into phonemes and words, and then link those words together to draw some semantic representation out of it and be able to understand it. We could talk about comprehension in the form of written language or the symbols that we use. What sequence of mental events allow you to do the same thing when you're, for example, reading what's on the screen? And how do we generate language? That's a very obviously hot topic, especially in the context of these comparative studies. What sets us apart from these lower creatures? So we're talking about the mechanics, the acoustics, and all sorts of other mental processes, the motoric aspects of language production, on top of obviously the semantic and grammatical structuring that has to be in place in order for your language to be comprehensible. And lastly, how do language and culture affect one another? And again, there are God knows how many studies and how many people engaged in this line of work. Again, the point is not to really delve into each one of these unless maybe the segment that we're talking about requires this, but this is just to show you, give you a taste of what people are involved in when they're talking about studying cognitive capacities and so on. So this, now we're getting more and more towards the upper echelons of mental processing, the top of the hierarchy. Executive functions are, or it is a term that's reserved predominantly for human mental capacities. It involves, not that it doesn't exist in lower primates or other creatures, but it seems to have reached its fullest development in humans, and that's possibly where we differ from these other creatures the most. What's allowed us to really stand out from all these other animals by the way we have conquered the planet and innovated stuff and formed culture and so on and so forth. But it all revolves around four pillars, executive functions. First, how do we pay attention to the contents of our working memory? Working memory is another fancy term for that short-lived memory reservoir we have, where we keep an information, a piece of information, or a string of information. Think about working memory as your mental shopping list, right? You're going to the store, you have a list of items you want to buy, and you have to somehow keep remembering what you wanted to buy, so you don't forget something or you don't take too many things and come home, if that is exactly what you want to do. So a specific, if you will, form of attention is that attention that is focused on the contents of working memory alone. So that's part of executive functions. Then our ability to switch our attention to different aspects of our behavior is also part of executive functioning. The ability to voluntarily suppress information processing or actions, particularly actions, the things you know you shouldn't say and you don't say, the things you know you shouldn't do and you don't do. Right? Those are the kinds of things that require this particular aspect of executive function. Something that's missing in some people. You know, they always say the wrong thing or they do the wrong thing, and something we sort of eventually get rid of as we grow older and older. Some of us never do. I know at least a couple of people like that. Right? So that is the process of inhibition, or this faculty we call inhibition, or part of executive function that we call inhibition. And how do we organize actions for the future, which has to do with our planning capacity to see into the future and coordinate our movements and behaviors for that. And on top of all of this, if you will, there is a global capacity to monitor which actions have been completed and which remain to be done, could be clumped up with the planning capacity together to form that fourth pillar of executive function. Boy, one last thing before the fun begins. So, reasoning and decision. Yes?
I just want to ask, how do we call these last things metacognition? Or?
Do we call?
I've always had trouble with distinguishing cognition from metacognition. And what is the...
Well, it depends. People have different definitions for that, which is why I'm hesitating to answer your question.
Yeah, my field of study is education. So in education, we kind of try to, sometimes we talk about cognition, sometimes we talk about metacognition, and then we, for example, when we talk about self-directed learning, we sometimes distinguish between strategies that are used for kind of empowering the cognition abilities and versus the metacognition abilities.
So, but what in your dictionary, how do you define metacognition?
Actually, I don't have a definition right now, but what I have perceived is that, okay, cognition is these mental processes that we kind of we go through in order to process some kind of information and all the things, and then metacognition is the cognition about cognition, they said.
Right.
And when you're kind of being aware of your cognition. So when you're talking about, let's say, I don't know, decision making or monitoring and these kinds of things, I thought that would be metacognition.
That appears, yeah. So that, which is why that executive functions are associated with our humanity more than any other aspect, because it gives us, they seem to give us that ability to exactly do what you just said, to have conscious awareness of our mental states, which is something that seems to be lacking in most of these lower creatures. Not all of them, but that ability to know that I am a free, willing agent in this world, and others have the same capacity as I do. That ability seems to arise ultimately from having executive functions, as opposed to having a memory or having attention or having language capacities. Yeah. And of course it could also emerge a lot from our ability to reason, and not so much with decision making, but these two are typically linked with one another because one follows the other. We reason, then we make a decision based on our reasoning. So it's basically what reasoning is cognitive processes by which people start with information and come to conclusions that go beyond that information. So you end up, well, you all know about inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning and all sorts of things that fit those definitions. So it's being able to draw conclusions that go obviously beyond the information at hand, and decision making is choosing one or a few alternatives among a number of choices that remain at the end of the reasoning process. And these could be in various domains, ranging from personal to professional decisions and so on. But what makes us come closer to the matter at hand today is this domain called problem solving. So what is a problem? It's an obstacle between the present state and the goal. Again, this is a very simple definition of the term, and the solution is removing it or circumventing the obstacle. So basically in problem solving, we're trying to get to the goal in the presence of an obstacle. As simple as that. And there are various ways obviously of doing this, and again this lends itself to scientific experimentation. Believe it or not, people are very good at designing very careful experiments to study various aspects of this problem, which is problem solving. And one of the questions that is often asked is, how does the ability to solve a problem depend on how the problem is being represented in the mind? If the problem is represented this way versus that way, will that have an impact on how you find the solution or how you achieve the end state or the end result? Is there anything special about what we call insight as a cognitive strategy? Insight being that aha moment where you've gone sort of flat in terms of your problem solving, you haven't really progressed an inch away from the initial state, and all of a sudden you come up with the answer without having gone through a systematic, stepwise, if you will, a removal of that obstacle. And I have some examples to show you in a bit. And lastly, since we are such linguistic creatures, can we use language to our advantage in order to solve problems? and in particular, can we use solutions from one domain in the form of an analogy to then apply it to a different domain and solve a problem that seems to have the same features, even though it looks completely different, but seems to map very, very well onto another problem that we've solved before in order to solve it. So that's how analogical reasoning and using analogies could become useful for problem solving. So having this little bit in mind, let me just take you back to this video where we saw a bit of problem solving skills of these apes, chimpanzees and orangutans in specific, on problem solving now. So remember we said that one of the ways one of the critical sort of steps of solving a problem is representing the information, if you will, correctly in our minds so we can move on and get to the end result. So this represents a problem that was presented a while ago by Kohler, one of the founders of the Gestalt School of Psychology, or the Gestalt School of Thought, which also did a massive service to psychology by describing and explaining a lot of phenomena in this area. So the idea was that it's the whole, basically, it's the whole of this visual representation that ends up being represented in somebody's mind, and that whole needs to somehow be manipulated so that the solution can manifest itself. So the problem here is, if you have this triangle drawn in this circle like that, and you represent the radius of this circle by the letter r, small r is radius, can you define x in terms of r?
It's R.
Exactly. So, I mean, you either have seen this before or you just did that in your own minds. All you have to do is flip that circle around, change the problem's representation, thus leading to the solution. Right? So, again, all that needs to be done is to think of this whole thing as a rectangle and the diagonals to be of the same size, therefore x is equal to r. As simple as that. Right? So that moment of realization is what we earlier referred to as insight. You didn't really go through a massive list of steps that you had to take, and even if you did take those steps, it all happened in a split second in your mind with that flipping of the mental representation. So obviously, insight has become a very, not that it has become a very important step, but it has become an important subject in studying problem solving, because it still remains mysterious how those pieces of information all come together to lead you from a moment where you have absolutely no clue what's going on to the next moment where you have found the solution. It's very different from the way, for example, you solve an algebraic problem, where you have to go through, very, very algorithmically, you have to go through various steps to get to the bottom of it. You may be faster than other people, so it takes you less time, but still certain steps have to be taken. Whereas some problems don't seem to have, or at least some solutions, don't require that sort of rigorous, stepwise problem solving. So, again, I'm going to cite a couple of studies here and there, but the point is not to bore you with academic stuff, but to show you really that this stuff has been studied very rigorously by scientists. So in order to make a distinction, or perhaps study insights a little better, Metcalf and Wiebe, they had groups of subjects that saw problems such as the triangle problem or the chain problem that you see a little bit later, actually right here. the triangle problem asks you to move only 3 of these dots to make the triangle pointing downwards instead of upwards, right? The chain problem presents itself as a woman had these 4 pieces of chain. She wanted to make a necklace out of them. She only had 15 cents. It takes 2 cents to cut a link and 3 cents to put it back together. So how can she turn these pieces into a singular ring or circle that she can put around her neck? Right, so you could be thinking about it over and over and try to tackle it from different angles. And what happens invariably is that people all of a sudden reach at the solution in both of these cases. And again, it's not very clearly known how it happens. But when you contrast it with non-insight type problems, such as those that you encounter in algebra, solving for x or finding the factors for an expression like that, you seem to at least characterize the solution phenomena or solution process a little better. So this is one of the earlier attempts at trying to understand how insight takes place, and this is how they did it. They asked these subjects to give warmth judgments every 15 seconds. Warmth judgments are what kids use to, when they've hidden something, they ask somebody else to go find it, and as they get closer, they say, "You're getting warmer, warmer, warmer," until they're really next to the object, and then they know that they found it. So it's that sort of thing. But this is the judgments that were expressed by the subjects themselves. They're every 15 seconds they're giving a warmth judgment from 0 to 7, 0 being having absolutely no clue what they're doing or being very far from the solution, and 7 being really at the solution point. You see, for the non-insight problems, there is this very sort of linear progression for reaching the solution, whereas for the insight problem, there is a very characteristic sort of exponential profile. You're going flat for most of the time, and all of a sudden the solution presents itself. So you're going from 3 to 7 in 15 seconds, whereas here you went from 3 to 7 in like 30 seconds or 45 seconds. Right? So again, this was one of the most one of the earliest and first attempts at looking at the differences in how insight versus non-insight problems are being solved. Now, part of the reason some problems have or people encounter difficulties with solving certain problems is that the way the problems are presented are ambiguous, or there is semantic there is semantic ambiguity, or there are conceptual obstacles that people encounter in their own minds, one of which I refer to as functional fixedness. So that functional fixedness was presented, at least delved into deeper by Dunker back in the 40s, where he asked subjects the following. Imagine there's a corkboard on a wall in a room. You have these pieces of let's say stuff, these items in front of you. You're asked to install a candle on the wall, light it, and make sure the candle doesn't drip. Okay? How do you do that?
Candle doesn't drip?
Doesn't drip. How do you do that? So, it takes some people maybe a long time to figure this out. Some people may see the answer very, very quickly. But it seems to, the problem for people who seem to have difficulty solving this revolves around seeing this as a container for matches only. Just like the problem for that girl or for the boy, the younger kids, was to see water as a drink only. but it could have other functions as well. So the solution you'll see a little bit later, but it involves basically taking the inside of this out, using a pin it to the wall as a stand, put the candle on top of it, and you've solved it. Obviously use the match, one of the matchsticks, and the outer box to light it, and you have achieved the goal. So it turns out that if you slightly change the content of the the problem, the way it's presented, or change the content of the visual representation of these items so that the box, let's say, is empty already, so people can see that it can have other functions, then it changes things. People who see, for example, boxes that are empty end up solving the problem much faster, have better accuracy solving the problem than people who see it just like you see it in the classical version of it. So another example is shown here. You're asked to somehow tie those two strings together, and they're exactly as you see them. They're far enough apart from each other that you can't reach both of them at the same time. And you have to use everything that's in that room. How do you achieve that?
Use the chair.
Sorry?
Use the chair. Put them.
It doesn't...
Yeah, use the chair, bring one closer, and then you get the other. But she probably thinks the chair is only for stepping on.
Yeah, but still, if you go up on the chair, you still don't reach the...
No, don't go on it. I said get it, the chair, grab the, bring the string closer, and then
Right. Or what...
Tie one of two to the chair and then...
That's it. Or tie one to the plier, swing it. It comes once you're holding the other one, and then you can tie them together. Again, a lot of people fail at this, or at least have a hard time solving it, because they're fixated on the normal function of a chair and a pair of pliers. What is it used for? Pulling, I don't know, nails out of something, or grabbing onto wire or something like that. Right? So this is where functional fixedness manifests itself the best, restricting the use of an object to its familiar functions. And we see already that these apes are surpassing this obstacle. They see water and their mouth all as part of the solution, right? Without ever having been trained to do anything like that, without having seen any of these problems or having received any explicit instruction. So it goes to show you that perhaps their understanding of their world, of their surrounding, in some ways is much deeper and more meaningful than ours, because they seem to be able to adjust the use of different things to the requirements of the moment. Yes.
So isn't it because of we are educated systematically, but they are naturally Do you think?
Possibly, because we are. Yeah, it could be. It could be because we are. We have a sort of single track of mind as a result of the way we're educated, and invariably those people who seem to break those boundaries end up being the ones who achieve, grandiose things in this life. For example, there's an anecdote about the inventor of Velcro. He went out one day with his dog and came back with lots of I forget what the actual term is. Parts of plants stuck to the dog's fur and to his pants, and he had no idea how he managed to gather so many of them. Hadn't possibly happened for the first time either, but it somehow caught his attention. Put it under the microscope. He saw that those plant parts have these hook-like structures, which are somehow tangled up in the loops that make the fabric of his pants, or around the fur of the dog. And turns that into this massive invention we call Velcro, which is a bunch of loops and a bunch of hooks that put together. They are very hard to dissociate, but most ordinary people would probably not pay attention to that, or even after having seen it, would not have thought much of it. But he managed to see beyond the ordinary and make something of it. I don't know what the reasoning is. I don't think anybody has been able to offer a uniform solution to why we are fixed in our ways of doing things. But that could be a very good answer. I mean, a very good proposition that we are trained to think in very specific terms, to think in restricted ways about how objects must be used and how they we should interact with them, and so on and so forth. Maybe the apes are free from that, therefore they can do whatever they want, and they see no boundaries. They see water, mouth. Okay, I can put water in my mouth. I can go put it in there. I don't know. I've never been an ape, but if I were, I think those would be the kinds of thoughts that would go through my mind.
But I think you're right, because we spend lots of energy to get into this structure, because when a kid grew up, we see that, for example, when he or she used the glass of water as a music instrument. I mean, some
we say no, it's
say,
not.
No, it's for drinking water.
For drinking water, yeah.
That's a process that we
oblige. It's quite plausible, yeah.
Well, like for the attention problem that you said, probably we can't attention at the same time on two things. I know a musician that he said when he wanted to be master in his musical instrument, he should read a novel while he was playing a very hard piece for about 1 hour. So it's possible. It's like we can, but because we are in a framework which is so limited.
Could be. But there are, at the same time, there are scientific reasons behind why we can't. Because certain things, for example, if you're using your cognitive capacities to navigate through the environment, you have to have a visual map representation of that world in your mind, so you know when to take a left turn, when to take a right turn, and be mindful of your surroundings. And at the same time, you're using the same resources that require you to interact with the keypad. You have to know where A is, where B is, where C is, in order to be able to construct a meaningful text message. Then those things are competing for the same resource. And that is obviously, I mean, you have to dedicate it to two things at the same time, so neither one is going to get a fair share of that resource. So, yes, people have studied splitting attention and so on, and it always works well when the tasks are almost orthogonal to each other. They have almost nothing to do with one another. Like reading a piece of text, which is almost a cognitive process, where as opposed to a motoric behavior. I mean, we could always sit in the car and talk to somebody and keep driving, so long as it doesn't involve giving them directions, because then we might end up again engaging the same resources and get into trouble. But oftentimes you get to your destination without even realizing whether you've passed, whether you stopped at all the lights, or whether you've abided by all the traffic rules and regulations, and you're still safe and sound. So it all depends on the context and on the demands that we're putting on the system. But I'm definitely with you on that. Some of these are the outcome of very sort of restricted way that we've been brought up in, and as a result, we're fixed in thinking certain ways about the world. So here's another example, very cool one, and it has to do with how a problem is stated. So you see the difficulty of the problem increasing or decreasing with the manner of its presentation. This is called the mutilated checkerboard problem, where instead of a normal 64 square checkerboard, you have removed one from each corner, so you're left with 62, and you're asked to cover this checkerboard. Well, you're asked the following question: can you use 31 domino pieces, which are rectangular, each one allowing you to cover 2 of these units at the same time, to cover this entire board? The answer is a simple yes or no. Now, it depends on how this problem is presented, right? If it's like this, it's the most difficult because there is no distinction between adjacent squares. If it's like this, it becomes a little bit easier, but not as easy as when the squares are actually labeled instead of colored. Black and pink or black and white and so on and so forth. And the easiest solution is this one, where you have different words written in different squares. Butter and bread. They belong to different categories. Now, what is the right answer to this problem, first of all? Can anybody tell me whether the board could be covered with 31 dominoes or not, if you take those 2 squares out?
No.
Again, it depends which group or which presentation of this problem you have seen in terms of how fast you get to that answer. If you look at this, or you look at maybe the colored version, you realize that these adjacent squares are always of the opposite color. Right? There's one dark, one light, one dark, one light. If you take 2 of the light ones out, then you don't have enough pairs to cover with these 31 dominoes. So the answer becomes obvious, an obvious no. Whereas if you start with this, where there is no distinction between them, it becomes almost impossible to say, unless you start really systematically going through the problem and covering pair by pair by pair to get to the bottom of it. So why I present this to you is because I want to show you how easily you would be able to solve that problem in the context of analogical reasoning, just a couple of minutes from now. But these are the solutions to the problems you saw earlier. How do you take this triangle and make it point downward with only 3 moves, moving only 3 dots? It's as simple as that. Take this one, put it here, take these 2, put them up here, and you have a downward pointing triangle. And the answer to how you make a continuous chain out of these with only 15 cents is that you basically cut one of them in, one set open, and use them as links to put the 3 back together. Make sense? Anyhow, and the answer to the candle problem, how you could install it on the wall without it dripping. I guess one good answer. Anyhow, so the question is now, really the last point I want to talk about before we carry on with the rest of the documentary. How can we use solution to one problem, or can we use a solution to one problem to apply it to another problem? And the answer seems to be a definite yes, depending again on a number of things. This again comes back to our ability to draw, to use analogies as a cognitive strategy to map one problem domain to another problem domain without paying attention to the external features of the 2 problems, sort of seeing the core of both of them and seeing how similar they are to one another. And it manifests itself in the following example. For example, if I had given you the Russian marriage problem, which is a well-known problem in the cognitive psychology domain. Not that there is a problem in Russia with marriage, but there's this anecdote that there was this Russian village which had 32 eligible bachelors and 32 single girls, single females, and the elders of the village did some sort of matchmaking and paired them all up so they would have a huge celebration of 32 weddings one evening. But the evening before the wedding, 2 men got drunk and they stuffed each other with pierogies and died. So now the question is, now that there are only 62 people left, can you still have 31 heterosexual marriages going on? Yeah, the point was to have heterosexual.
Where in Russia is it? In Chechen?
And the answer is no, because you've lost 2 males and can't compensate for it anyway. Now, if you've been presented with that problem first, and then you see the checkerboard problem, right? It doesn't take a genius to see that they're identical in nature, except you've replaced the men with light squares and the females with dark squares, but the essence of the problem remains the same. So the solution presents itself just like that because you've already solved it once in a different context. So that's what we're talking about, having a source problem and a target problem, and this process of mental mapping of the internal features of these two to one another to be able to use one solution effectively for another. Geek and Holyoke did again systematic study of this. They said that they concluded that the successful completion of these sorts of problems revolves around noticing relationships and mapping correspondence between the source and the target, of course, being able to apply that mapping very accurately. And Dunker did sort of redid this marriage problem and the checkerboards in a different context. He presented his subjects with the following story first. Let me just click over these. That there was this castle in which a dictator lived, and there were some rebels led by a general who wanted to take over, and one day decided to come and rescue the inhabitants of this village. And the story goes on and on. It's like half a page long. But essentially, what they discovered before attacking this place is that all the roads leading to the many entrances to the castle are all planted with mines. And these mines will go off if a large number of people start walking on them. But if there are only a few people, they're spared and they could approach the gates and go through them. So what he does is that he splits up his army into several factions, and they all come in from different pathways, and they all safely enter, conquer, and free the people, and so on and so forth. And people live happily ever after. Then he tells this story, and then he says, okay, now suppose you're a doctor. I have the actual text, but I'll tell you this in a nutshell. You're a doctor who has to perform a surgery, has to treat somebody's tumor. Somebody has a stomach tumor, but you know that you definitely cannot operate on them, yet you can use radiation to destroy the tumor. But for the beam to be strong enough to destroy the tumor, it would also destroy the tissue on the way to the tumor. So is there a way you could use radiation to treat this patient, save them from dying? The answer is right before you, right? Split radiation into separate beams, have them converge upon the source, like that, just like the castle problem, right? So if you've actually paid attention to the internal structure of that problem, it becomes infinitely easier for you to solve this as opposed to someone who just hears about the second problem for the first time, without that context, without that introduction. And in fact, it turns out that this methodology is actually being used even today. It's called the gamma ray therapy. That allows you to split gamma beams into several less strong beams, weaker beams, and converge them upon a node where the tumor is and zap it away. Right? So obviously, when we talk about using analogies and language to both present and solve a problem, we are restricted specifically, very strictly, to the human domain, because we know for a fact that to this day we don't have talking apes. But they still baffle us with their ability to use objects creatively, and to even take the step further and show the emergence of some of those human capacities, such as planning and executive functions, as you see in a little bit. So with that, I think I'm going to a presentation, and I'd like to draw your attention to the remainder of this video.